The camera drifts slowly over a wasteland. Once, this had been a city, streets filled with workers, children running between factories, smoke from chimneys rising against the sky. Now there is only ruin. Blackened walls stand like broken teeth, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Snow falls quietly on twisted steel and shattered glass. In the silence, you can almost hear the ghosts. But then, faintly, comes another sound, boots crunching over debris, the ragged breathing of men half-starved, half-frozen, and fully terrified. These are the soldiers of Hitler's proud Sixth Army. Only months earlier, they had stormed across Europe, undefeated, unstoppable. Now, they are trapped inside a city that has become their coffin. The name of that city is Stalingrad, and to the Germans, it will forever be known as the graveyard of the Wehrmacht. Why here? Why this place? On a map, Stalingrad was just another industrial city on the banks of the Volga River. But to Adolf Hitler, it was more than that. It was personal. It carried the name of his greatest enemy, Joseph Stalin. To conquer it would be to humiliate the Soviet Union, to strike at its heart. And so, in the summer of 1942, he sent hundreds of thousands of men east, across the steppe, into the jaws of hell. What awaited them was not victory, but annihilation. Over the next months, Stalingrad would descend into a nightmare beyond imagination. Entire blocks fought over like single trenches. Basements turned into tombs. Soldiers dying for a single room, a single hallway, a single staircase. The Luftwaffe bombed the city into dust, but instead of breaking Soviet resistance, they created a fortress of rubble where every corner could hide a sniper. Every wall concealed an ambush. And as winter closed in, the hunters became the hunted. This is not just the story of a battle. This is the story of how the most powerful army in the world marched into a city and never came out. In the summer of 1942, Adolf Hitler was desperate for one thing above all: oil. His war machine, tanks, planes, trucks, every instrument of blitzkrieg, ran on fuel. And the vast oil fields of the Caucasus, deep inside Soviet territory, with a glittering prize he could not resist. If Germany could seize that oil, the war might be his. Without it, the Reich's days were numbered. But Hitler was not satisfied with strategy alone. He was obsessed with symbols. On his maps, one name stood out in bold letters: Stalingrad. To him, it was more than an industrial city. It carried the name of his greatest enemy, Joseph Stalin. To take it would be to humiliate the Soviet leader in front of the world. To smash the city that bore his name would send a message that the Third Reich was unstoppable, that Stalin could not even protect the city that carried his own legacy. And so, Hitler gave the order. Operation Blue was launched. The Wehrmacht poured eastward across the steppe, sweeping aside Soviet resistance in a storm of fire and steel. The Sixth Army under General Paulus spearheaded the advance, supported by the 4th Panzer Army. By July 1942, they were deep inside Soviet territory, their banners fluttering in the summer wind, convinced they were on the road to triumph. At first, it looked like nothing could stop them. Town after town fell. Soviet forces reeled backward. The German advance was so fast, so confident, that many officers believed the war in the East would soon be over. One last push, they thought, and the Red Army will collapse. But the Soviets were not collapsing. They were trading space for time, retreating deeper into their homeland, burning fields and destroying bridges, forcing the Germans to extend their supply lines ever further. Behind the lines, the factories of the Urals and Siberia churned out tanks, rifles, and planes in unimaginable numbers. And as the Wehrmacht pushed forward, the Soviet High Command was preparing a counterstroke that would turn the tide of the war. Still, the Germans pressed on. By late August, Paulus's Sixth Army reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. From a distance, the city looked vulnerable, smokestacks rising from factories, rows of apartment blocks, the wide sweep of the Volga glistening in the sun. For the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, this seemed like the final objective before the march south to the oil fields. But when they entered the city, they discovered something else entirely. Stalingrad was not just a city. It was a fortress. Every street, every building, every pile of rubble became a battlefield. Hitler demanded that the city be taken at any cost. Paulus obeyed. Day after day, the Luftwaffe bombed Stalingrad into dust. The fires raged so fiercely that the sky turned black. Civilians were slaughtered in their homes, crushed beneath collapsing buildings, burned alive in cellars. To the Germans, this seemed like victory, obliteration. But in truth, they had created the perfect battleground for the defenders. The Soviet commander, General Zhukov, understood what was coming. He prepared his men for the horror ahead. House-to-house combat, fighting for every room, every staircase, every corner. There would be no easy victory in Stalingrad. For Paulus and the Sixth Army, the real nightmare was only beginning. Stalingrad was not a city of palaces or cathedrals. It was a city of smoke and steel. Stretching for miles along the west bank of the Volga River, it was an industrial giant. Vast tractor factories that had been converted to produce tanks, workshops that churned out rifles and artillery shells, oil refineries, shipyards, warehouses stacked with supplies. The city's lifeblood was the Volga itself, a wide, sweeping river that linked north to south, carrying grain, oil, and weapons from the heart of the Soviet Union. Whoever controlled Stalingrad controlled the river, and whoever controlled the river controlled the flow of war. But there was something more. This was not just another industrial hub. It was Stalingrad, the city of Stalin. The name alone gave it weight. To the Red Army, it was a symbol of resistance, a place that simply could not be surrendered without dishonor. To the ordinary Soviet citizen, it was a rallying cry. If Stalingrad fell, what city could possibly stand? To Joseph Stalin himself, it was personal. He sent a simple, brutal order to his commanders. Not a step back. There would be no retreat, no surrender. The city must be held at any cost. The people of Stalingrad understood what that meant. As the German armies pushed closer, the civilians of the city began preparing for war. Factories worked around the clock, not only producing weapons, but also reinforcing buildings for defense. Women, children, and the elderly dug trenches, built barricades, and laid mines on the approaches to the city. Every man able to carry a rifle was handed one, often alongside just a few rounds of ammunition. Entire battalions of workers' militias were formed. Men straight from the assembly lines, still in their overalls, marching out with weapons that had been produced only hours before. The city braced itself like a clenched fist. Apartment blocks were fortified into strongpoints, with sandbags at the windows and machine gun nests in basements. Sewer tunnels were mapped out for surprise attacks. Snipers took up positions in factories, water towers, and the twisted ruins of bombed-out houses. Even schoolchildren were trained to throw Molotov cocktails. Stalingrad was becoming a labyrinth of traps, prepared to swallow an invader whole. When the first Luftwaffe raids came in late August, the effect was apocalyptic. The Germans unleashed wave after wave of bombers, turning whole districts into smoking rubble. Thousands of civilians died in a single day. But instead of breaking the city spirit, the destruction only hardened it. The ruins became cover for defenders. Rubble piles turned into barricades. Fires lit the night sky, casting a hellish glow over the Volga, but still the people dug in. The Volga itself became both lifeline and graveyard. Barges ferried soldiers and supplies across under constant fire, often sinking before reaching shore. Yet more kept coming, paddling through burning oil slicks and floating wreckage. Reinforcements slipped into the city by night, even as civilians continued to be evacuated under heavy shelling. By the time the German Sixth Army finally reached the outskirts, Stalingrad was no longer just a city. It was a fortress made not of stone, but of human will. When the German Sixth Army finally reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in late August 1942, Hitler unleashed his most devastating weapon, the Luftwaffe. Day after day, wave after wave of bombers swept over the city, their engines drowning out every other sound. What had once been factories, apartment blocks, and bustling boulevards was reduced to a jagged skeleton of brick and steel. The bombs fell with mechanical precision, but the destruction was anything but orderly. Whole neighborhoods vanished in a single afternoon. Flames consumed entire streets, and smoke turned the sky a permanent shade of gray. Within 48 hours, Stalingrad was transformed into a graveyard. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed, buried beneath rubble or burned alive in the infernos. The Volga, once a shining artery of trade and transport, was choked with oil slicks and floating corpses. For many, there was no escape. The river crossings were under constant fire, and barges loaded with refugees were bombed before they could reach safety. Survivors who made it to the far bank often turned around, ferried back into the burning city, not to flee, but to fight. Yet amid the chaos, something extraordinary happened. The Soviet defenders did not break. Instead, they dug in. Soldiers and civilians alike turned ruins into fortresses. Stalin's infamous order, "Not a step back," echoed through every bunker and trench. For the Red Army, retreat meant execution. For the people of Stalingrad, it meant death at German hands. There was only one option: to fight, street by street, house by house, room by room. The destruction that the Luftwaffe had intended as a prelude to conquest became a double-edged sword. The bombed-out cityscape gave the defenders cover. Snipers nestled in collapsed walls. Machine gunners fired from basements and sewer grates. Soviet troops, clad in rags and dust, seemed to rise out of the rubble itself, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. The Germans would call it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats, a battle fought in cellars, staircases, and alleys, where the enemy was always just a wall away. But while soldiers adapted to the carnage, civilians lived in an unending nightmare. Families hid in basements, the air thick with dust and the smell of burning flesh. Food ran out within days. Mothers boiled wallpaper for the paste, mixing it with weeds and river water to keep their children alive. Stories spread of civilians digging graves in their own courtyards, marking them with broken furniture when wood for crosses ran out. One survivor, a young girl named Ludmila, recalled how she and her mother spent weeks underground, listening to bombs rain down above them. They survived on crusts of bread and melted snow. Each morning, she would creep to the surface, scanning the ruins for anything edible. Once, she found a dead horse in the street, already swarming with flies. Dozens of starving people tore at its flesh with knives, bare hands, even teeth. That night, she brought a strip of meat back to her mother. It was the first time they had eaten in 3 days. Another tale came from a schoolteacher who refused to abandon her students. When the bombing began, she gathered them in the basement of the school, teaching lessons by candlelight even as the building shook around them. "If we are to die," she said, "we will die as Soviets, not as animals." Many of her students never made it out of the city, but those who did remembered her words for the rest of their lives. The civilians of Stalingrad became unwilling soldiers in a war they had not chosen. They carried water to the front lines, dug trenches beside soldiers, and in many cases picked up rifles themselves. Children served as scouts, darting through alleys to relay messages. Women hurled Molotov cocktails at advancing German tanks. Every life in the city became a weapon. By the end of that first week of bombing, Stalingrad was no longer simply a target. It was a furnace of human suffering and defiance. The Luftwaffe had reduced it to rubble, but in doing so, they had created the perfect battlefield for the Soviets. The city had become a trap, and the Germans were walking straight into it. If the Luftwaffe had turned Stalingrad into rubble, General Vasily Zhukov turned that rubble into a weapon. Appointed commander of the 62nd Army, he understood that the Germans thrived on mobility, air power, and artillery barrages. To neutralize these advantages, Zhukov introduced a brutal tactic: hugging the enemy. Soviet troops clung to German positions at distances so close, sometimes only a few yards, that airstrikes and artillery risked hitting their own men. It was fighting reduced to the most primitive level: knives, grenades, and bayonets inside shattered rooms, hand-to-hand struggles where survival was measured in minutes. One of the most famous examples of this resistance was Pavlov's house, officially just a 4-story apartment block near the Volga. It became a fortress when Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and his small detachment seized it from the Germans in September. Over the next 2 months, they held out against endless assaults. They fortified the building with machine gun nests, laid mines, and connected trenches to supply lines across the street. From its windows, Soviet riflemen commanded a wide field of fire, cutting down wave after wave of attackers. Pavlov's house became such a thorn in the German advance that some soldiers joked it took more men and time to capture this single building than it would have to seize Paris. But the battle for Stalingrad wasn't just fought with machine guns. It was also fought through the scope of a sniper's rifle. Among them rose Vasily Zaitsev, a young hunter from the Ural Mountains whose skill and patience turned him into a legend. Zaitsev used the ruins to his advantage, camouflaging himself among twisted beams and broken bricks. Each day, he stalked the German lines, killing dozens with precise, calculated shots. His most famous duel came against a supposed German super sniper, a deadly game of cat and mouse that lasted days. Whether the story was fact or Soviet propaganda, Zaitsev's reputation soared, inspiring his comrades and demoralizing the enemy. In this urban hell, every building was a fortress, every street a killing ground, every pile of rubble a potential sniper's nest. The Germans expected to sweep through Stalingrad in days. Instead, they found themselves bleeding for every staircase and every ruined wall. By late autumn of 1942, Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a graveyard. Entire districts had been reduced to skeletal ruins, with walls scarred by gunfire and streets filled with the smell of smoke and death. The Germans pushed relentlessly, capturing block after block. But they soon discovered that victory in Stalingrad meant conquering the same building dozens of times. A single warehouse or factory floor could change hands multiple times in a single day, each exchange leaving piles of bodies as mute testimony to the struggle. Fighting took on a nightmarish intimacy. Soldiers grappled in basements, lunged at each other with knives in stairwells, and traded grenades across shattered doorways. The Soviets called this Rat War, a brutal, close-quarters contest where heavy tanks and artillery were often useless. German troops, trained for blitzkrieg and open maneuver warfare, found themselves bogged down in a grind that eroded their strength and morale. Meanwhile, Soviet defenders, motivated by desperation and discipline, melted into the ruins, emerging like phantoms to ambush their enemies. Despite their superior weapons and initial momentum, the Germans could not secure the city. By November, they controlled nearly 90% of Stalingrad, yet the Soviets still clung fiercely to the banks of the Volga. These narrow footholds allowed reinforcements and supplies to trickle across under constant shelling. For every street conquered, the Germans paid in blood. For every factory seized, they found another maze of bunkers and tunnels where defenders refused to yield. The toll was staggering. Tens of thousands lay dead in the rubble, whole battalions erased in the span of days. German commanders grew frustrated as their once unstoppable divisions dwindled into shadows of themselves. Soviet losses were equally horrific. Fresh recruits often survived only hours in combat. Civilians who had not fled suffered alongside the soldiers, dying of hunger, exposure, or stray shells that made no distinction between fighter and innocent. Stalingrad had become a vortex, sucking in men and machines at a pace neither side could sustain. But while the Germans bled out in the ruins, the Soviets endured, holding on just long enough for something greater to come. For beyond the Volga, the Red Army was gathering strength, preparing the trap that would change not only the battle, but the course of the entire war. On the frozen morning of November 19, 1942, the quiet along the Stalingrad front shattered. At 7:30 a.m., the Red Army unleashed Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive designed to encircle the German Sixth Army. Rather than striking the heart of Stalingrad, Soviet planners aimed their assault at the weaker flanks, where Hitler had stationed his less reliable allies, the Romanians, Hungarians, and Italians, to hold the line. It was a brilliant stroke of strategy. These Axis satellite armies were poorly equipped, lacking proper winter clothing, tanks, and heavy artillery. When Soviet T-34s and waves of infantry surged across the snow, the defenders crumbled almost instantly. Romanian positions collapsed within hours. Soldiers fled or surrendered in droves, leaving huge gaps in the German defense. The blizzard of Soviet artillery, combined with armored spearheads, tore open the front like a knife through paper. Within days, two massive Soviet pincers, one from the north, another from the south, drove deep behind the German lines. On November 23rd, near the town of Kalach, the two Soviet fronts met, sealing the trap. A steel ring had snapped shut around General Friedrich Paulus and the German Sixth Army. Over 300,000 Axis troops were trapped inside the Stalingrad pocket, cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and any chance of escape. At first, Hitler dismissed the danger. He assured Paulus that the Luftwaffe could resupply the encircled army by air. But this was a dangerous illusion. The Sixth Army required at least 700 tons of supplies per day. The Luftwaffe barely managed a fraction of that, often less than 100 tons, and only when the weather allowed. Planes were shot down, airfields were bombed, and food, ammunition, and fuel dwindled rapidly. Soldiers began slaughtering horses for meat, while ammunition rationing crippled their ability to fight back. The psychological blow was immense. The once victorious Wehrmacht, which had marched triumphantly through Europe, now found itself starving and freezing in a death trap. Soviet troops, invigorated by their success, tightened the noose, pressing closer to the city's ruins from which the Germans could not withdraw. As the weeks dragged on, the German High Command debated options. Some generals urged a breakout attempt, while others begged Hitler to allow Paulus to retreat before the pocket closed completely. But Hitler's orders were unwavering. Stalingrad must be held, not one step back. The Sixth Army was forbidden to withdraw. What had begun as a campaign for oil and glory had transformed into a nightmare of hunger, frostbite, and despair. Operation Uranus had done more than just trap an army. It marked the turning point of World War II on the Eastern Front. For the first time, the German war machine had suffered a decisive and irrecoverable blow. What remained inside the Stalingrad pocket was not just an army. It was the pride of Hitler's Reich. And now, it was slowly being strangled to death. The steel jaws of the Soviet encirclement had snapped shut, and yet Hitler refused to acknowledge reality. To him, Stalingrad was not just a battlefield, it was a symbol of prestige, and losing it was unthinkable. His orders to General Friedrich Paulus were clear, absolute, and merciless. Hold the city at all costs, not one step back. For Paulus, this was a death sentence. The Sixth Army, exhausted from months of brutal house-to-house fighting, was now surrounded by an enemy that grew stronger by the day. The prospect of breaking out before the trap fully tightened had briefly existed, but Hitler crushed any hope of withdrawal. Instead, he demanded that Stalingrad be transformed into a fortress to be defended to the last man. To sustain this impossible command, the Führer placed his faith in the Luftwaffe. Hermann Göring, eager to preserve his reputation, boldly assured Hitler that his air force could supply the Sixth Army by air. He promised that hundreds of transport planes would ferry food, fuel, and ammunition into the pocket daily. On paper, the plan required at least 700 tons of supplies each day. In practice, the Luftwaffe rarely delivered more than 100. Winter weather made flying nearly impossible. Soviet fighters prowled the skies, while anti-aircraft fire tore through the slow-moving transport planes. Entire squadrons of Junkers Ju-52s were destroyed, their wrecks burning on frozen airstrips. Even when supplies did reach the pocket, they were pitiful, barely enough to keep the army alive, let alone fighting. Inside Stalingrad, the reality was stark. Rations were cut to starvation levels. Ammunition ran out. Soldiers dug into cellars and ruined buildings, shivering in temperatures that plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. Horses were slaughtered for food, and frozen corpses piled up in the snow. Morale collapsed as men realized they had been abandoned to die in the ruins of a city they no longer believed could be held. Still, Paulus obeyed his orders. Bound by duty, fear, and Hitler's direct command, he refused to attempt a breakout. The once proud Sixth Army, which had marched across Europe as a symbol of Nazi might, was now reduced to a starving, freezing garrison, waiting for salvation that would never come. The trap had closed, and with it, the fate of Germany's war in the East was sealed. Inside the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, the men of the German Sixth Army were trapped in a nightmare with no end. Food had all but vanished. What little bread remained was stretched with sawdust or ground beans, creating loaves so hard they broke teeth. Each soldier received only a few hundred calories a day, barely enough to keep a man alive, let alone fighting in sub-zero temperatures. Hunger gnawed at them constantly, turning comrades into rivals for scraps of food. When the rations ran out, the soldiers turned to desperate measures. The horses that had carried them across Russia were slaughtered, their frozen carcasses hacked apart with bayonets and cooked over fires made from broken furniture. Soon, even the horses were gone. Stories circulated of soldiers boiling leather belts, boots, and wallpaper paste, anything that might quiet the emptiness in their stomachs. The cold was merciless. Temperatures plunged to -30°C. Without winter clothing, men froze to death in their trenches, their bodies stiff and brittle by morning. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes, forcing crude amputations with field knives in filthy cellars. Lice spread uncontrollably, burrowing into the seams of uniforms, spreading disease and misery. Dysentery and typhus took hold, weakening men until they could no longer stand. Medical supplies were non-existent. Field hospitals became places of horror, where wounded soldiers lay on the floor, untreated, because there were no bandages, no morphine, no doctors left with strength to work. Death was constant, and the living grew numb to it. Frozen corpses were stacked in heaps, used as makeshift walls against Soviet fire. Morale disintegrated. Letters home were filled with despair, but many never reached Germany. Soldiers whispered of betrayal, realizing that Hitler's promises of relief were lies. Rumors of a breakout spread through the ranks, but Paulus's rigid obedience crushed every hope. The men no longer fought for victory. They fought simply to survive another day. By January, the once mighty Sixth Army, hundreds of thousands strong, was reduced to a hollow shell. Starvation, cold, and disease killed more men than Soviet bullets. Those still standing were emaciated shadows of themselves, their eyes hollow, their wills broken. The city that Hitler had demanded be held at all costs had become a graveyard for his army. Inside the encirclement, Stalingrad was no longer a battlefield. It was a prison, a slow execution ground where an entire army wasted away, abandoned by its leaders, surrounded by an enemy growing stronger each day. As the trapped German Sixth Army withered inside the ruins of Stalingrad, hope came from the south. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Hitler's most brilliant commanders, was ordered to organize a rescue mission. In December 1942, he launched Operation Winter Storm, a desperate gamble to break through Soviet lines and reach Paulus's encircled troops. Manstein's forces, spearheaded by the 4th Panzer Army, fought ferociously. Against the bitter winter winds, German tanks rolled forward, smashing Soviet defenses in a relentless drive across the steppe. For the starving men in Stalingrad, rumors of the relief force spread like wildfire. Many believed salvation was finally at hand. The distant rumble of artillery, the faint echo of armored clashes, they could almost sense their comrades fighting their way closer. By mid-December, Manstein's spearhead came within 30 miles of the Sixth Army's pocket. In military terms, that was within reach. A bold breakout from Paulus's lines could have joined with Manstein's advance, saving at least part of the trapped army. For a brief moment, the impossible seemed possible. But then came Hitler's command: hold Stalingrad at all costs. Paulus was forbidden to attempt a breakout. He was to defend the city, not abandon it, no matter the circumstances. Even as his men starved and froze, Paulus followed his orders with rigid loyalty. Without movement from inside the pocket, Manstein's relief force could not succeed. Soviet counterattack stiffened, and their reserves poured into the battlefield. The opportunity slipped away. Operation Winter Storm stalled, and Manstein, realizing the futility, was forced to retreat. For the men inside Stalingrad, the news was devastating. Their last, best chance at survival had vanished. All that remained was hunger, cold, and the slow tightening of the Soviet noose. The failure of Winter Storm was not just a tactical defeat. It was a psychological death blow. Soldiers inside the city understood now that no help was coming. They were abandoned, trapped in a frozen tomb by the Volga. The once proud Sixth Army, veterans of countless victories, had been condemned by their own leader's stubbornness. From this point on, the fate of Stalingrad was sealed. Hitler's refusal to allow Paulus to break out meant the German army had lost not only the city, but also the chance to save itself. Stalingrad was no longer a battle to be won. It was a catastrophe waiting to unfold. By January 1943, the agony inside Stalingrad reached its breaking point. The Soviet Red Army, tightening its grip with each passing day, launched fresh offensives that tore into the already weakened German defenses. On January 10th, Operation Ring began, a systematic, crushing assault aimed at eliminating the encircled Sixth Army once and for all. Soviet artillery pounded the German pocket relentlessly, reducing what remained of the city to an inferno of smoke, ice, and shattered bodies. The Sixth Army, once 300,000 strong, was now a shadow of itself. Starving men wandered the ruins, wrapped in rags, their rifles frozen solid in the bitter cold. Ammunition was running out. Horses had long since been eaten. The dead lay unburied, frozen stiff in the snow. Morale collapsed under the weight of hunger, frostbite, and the dawning realization that there would be no miracle escape. On January 22nd, Paulus finally reported the truth to Hitler. His army could no longer fight. Supplies were exhausted. Soldiers were dying in droves each day. Still, Hitler's response was cold and unwavering. You must stand fast. Capitulation is impossible. To reinforce his demand, he promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal, the highest honor in the German army. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive. The message was clear. Hitler expected him to fight to the death or commit suicide. But Paulus, a career officer loyal to his men more than to ideology, refused to sacrifice what remained of them for Hitler's pride. On January 31st, 1943, Soviet forces stormed Paulus's command post in the southern pocket. Exhausted, pale, and numb from weeks of starvation, Paulus surrendered. The once proud commander of the Sixth Army, who had marched across half of Europe, now became a prisoner of war in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. 2 days later, on February 2nd, 1943, the northern pocket of resistance crumbled. What remained of the German Sixth Army, tens of thousands of frostbitten, starving men, laid down their arms. Of the nearly 300,000 who had been trapped, fewer than 90,000 were taken prisoner. Only around 5,000 would ever return home after years in Soviet captivity. The rest perished in the gulags, succumbing to disease, malnutrition, and despair. The fall of Stalingrad sent shockwaves across the world. For the first time, Nazi Germany had suffered a decisive, undeniable defeat. The myth of Hitler's invincibility was shattered. In Berlin, shock turned to fear, as families realized the war might not end in victory. Across occupied Europe, Stalingrad became a symbol of resistance, proof that the Nazi war machine could be beaten. For the Soviet Union, it was a moment of triumph. The Red Army had not only defended their city, but destroyed one of Germany's most elite armies. The graveyard of the Wehrmacht, as Stalingrad was now called, marked the turning of the tide. From this point forward, the Germans would be pushed back, step by bloody step, until they were driven all the way to Berlin. Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was the death knell of Hitler's dreams of conquest. The ruins along the Volga became a monument to endurance, sacrifice, and the sheer will of a people who refused to surrender. When the guns finally fell silent in February 1943, the ruins of Stalingrad stood as a grim monument to human endurance and destruction. The cost had been staggering. The German Sixth Army, once considered one of the most formidable fighting forces in the world, was annihilated. Out of more than 300,000 men who had marched toward the Volga with confidence in Hitler's vision of conquest, only a fraction survived the encirclement. Tens of thousands were taken prisoner, trudging eastward into Soviet captivity. Most would never return. Disease, starvation, and brutal conditions in labor camps reduced their numbers until barely a trickle of survivors came back to Germany years later. The loss reverberated far beyond the battlefield. For the first time in the war, the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility was shattered. German propaganda had boasted of endless victories since 1939, from Poland to France to the Balkans. Now, for the first time, the Nazi war machine had been not just halted but decisively destroyed. The aura of inevitability surrounding Hitler's armies evaporated in the frozen rubble of Stalingrad. Both Axis allies and neutral observers took note. The Reich was no longer unbeatable. For the Soviet Union, the victory was nothing less than a turning point. It transformed the mood of the nation. Only a year earlier, the Red Army had reeled back in disarray, surrendering vast swaths of territory. But now the tide had turned. The defense and ultimate triumph at Stalingrad ignited a sense of pride and momentum. From this moment forward, Soviet forces would remain on the offensive, driving westward with relentless determination. Within 2 years, they would reach the heart of Berlin itself. Politically, Stalingrad also shifted global perceptions. To the Allies in London and Washington, it proved that the Soviet Union could bear the weight of Germany's military might. It reinforced the necessity of opening a second front, while also signaling that Stalin would emerge from the war not as a desperate ally, but as a powerful victor demanding influence in post-war Europe. In many ways, the geopolitical shape of the Cold War was already foreshadowed in the ruins of Stalingrad. The psychological scars were equally profound. For Germany, the defeat sowed seeds of doubt in both soldiers and civilians. Mothers and fathers back home, who had cheered their sons into uniform, now faced silence, telegrams, or the slow agony of never hearing from them again. Confidence in Hitler's leadership wavered, though his propaganda machine tried desperately to spin the disaster as a heroic sacrifice. For Soviet citizens, the suffering endured was unforgettable. The hunger, the bombings, the sight of entire families buried beneath rubble. Yet they also clung to pride, the knowledge that their sacrifices had helped turn the war. Even today, Stalingrad remains a symbol far larger than the battle itself. It stands as a lesson about hubris and resilience, about the horrors that come when ideology demands victory at all costs, and about the resilience of ordinary people when pushed to their limits. The name alone, Stalingrad, has come to signify both catastrophe and triumph, tragedy and endurance. And yet, one haunting question lingers, echoing through history. What if Hitler had allowed Paulus to retreat? Could the Sixth Army have escaped the encirclement and lived to fight another day? Might Germany have prolonged the war, or even altered its outcome? Historians endlessly debate these possibilities. But what is certain is that Hitler's obsession with prestige, his refusal to permit withdrawal, sealed the fate of his men and altered the trajectory of the Second World War. In the end, the ruins of Stalingrad whisper both a warning and a reminder. They remind us of the cost of arrogance, the price of fanaticism, and the unbreakable will of those who resist tyranny against all odds. From the smoking rubble rose not only the beginning of Nazi Germany's downfall, but also a story that continues to resonate across generations. Stalingrad was not just a battle, it was the breaking point of an empire,